Welcome, everyone, to the panel, What would Russia look like after the end of the war in Ukraine? And I guess after the intense discussions that we had over NATO, over EU, over the transatlantic community, I think it's very courageous to have this debate now, and I cannot be but very honored to be here, and I cannot be more grateful to you, our distinguished members of audience, that given the impressive panels that run at this time, you decided to be here. Therefore, I guess, dear Vladimir, that everyone who's here know about your activity. So I guess every presentation that I might attempt to do would be futile, to say the very least. We have just 1 hour, or less than 1 hour. I guess we're a bit late. But we will try to make the best of it. So the topic that we have today in front of us, I think it's very important and very interesting for most of the people, senior advisors, politicians, my fellow members from academia, and common people, especially in this region. Some, of course, are interested in how Russia would look like in the future out of intellectual curiosity. Some out of professional duty. They have to research how Russia would look like. But I guess, and again, I stress, especially for the people in this region, I think analyzing, understanding Russia, it's a matter of vital, immediate national interest. So, with this in mind, I know this is your first visit in Romania, so there are many things I would recommend you to learn about our beautiful country. But if there's one that I would focus on, would be that people are very friendly here, so I will be very friendly as well. I will start with the easy questions. I will try to be as direct as I can, because I think everyone here is more than willing to hear you, your thoughts about the future of your country. So, the easy question first, dear Vladimir, how and when will the war actually finish? And what is the minimum, short of Ukrainian capitulation, that Russia might accept, and how it will project the idea of victory?
Thank you so much, Cosmin. That was an easy question, right? I want to thank the New Strategy Center and George Scutaro for the invitation. It is indeed my first time in Romania, and it's an honor to be here at this conference with all of you. And I want to thank Dr. Cosmin IONIșțân from University of Bucharest for moderating our conversation. It's always a bit daunting and intimidating to be talking to a history professor. I'm a former historian myself, so thank you for the question again, and I look forward to the rest of our conversation. The short answer is this war will not end for as long as Vladimir Putin remains in power. This man means war. This man means aggression. He has been in power for 25 years. And for all the time he has been in power, he has continued to kill. We all remember that back in 1999, Vladimir Putin was coming to the Kremlin on the back of a brutal war in Chechnya and the mysterious, quote-unquote, explosions in residential apartment buildings across Russia, which now almost nobody doubts were orchestrated by Putin's own FSB to create this public hysteria and a justification for the war in Chechnya, which eventually propelled him to the presidency. And for all the time this man has been in power, the two pillars of his regime have been internal repression and external aggression. And if we look at the history of Russia, those two always go together. They're always two sides of the same coin, and which I guess is very logical in a sense, because a regime that does not respect the rights and freedoms of its own people that disregards its own laws and its own constitution is not going to abide by the civilized norms of international behavior. It's not going to respect the borders of its neighbors either. You know, there's this fashionable myth that has often been propagated, usually for reasons of self-justification by some politicians, policymakers, analysts, journalists, both in Russia and in the West. The myth that there were kind of two different Putins. Right? There was the early Putin, who was okay, who believed in modernization and reform and cooperation with the West, and then something went horribly wrong along the way. And now there is this late Putin who's doing all this horrendous stuff. To my mind, nothing could be further from the truth. Vladimir Putin was Vladimir Putin from the very beginning. In fact, I remember the exact day when I understood just who this man was and just what direction he will take our country. This was the 20th of December, 1999, 20th of December being the Chekist Day, the day that Russian security services still astonishingly celebrate as the anniversary of the founding of the Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police, in December 1917. On that day, Mr. Putin, of course himself a Chekist, came to Lubyanka Square in Moscow. He was still prime minister at the time. He came to the main KGB, now FSB headquarters, to officially unveil a memorial plaque to Yuri Andropov. Now, Russia is a country of symbols, and Putin could not have chosen a more potent, a more powerful symbol to indicate the direction of his future rule. Because to anybody who knows the modern history of Russia, Andropov symbolizes, embodies the worst of the Soviet system. He represents everything that was wrong with the communist system in the Soviet Union, both in terms of internal repression and in terms of external aggression. As Soviet ambassador to Budapest, he was one of the architects of the invasion of Hungary in 1956. As longtime head of the Soviet KGB, he prioritized the suppression of domestic political dissent in the country. That was his main priority at the head of that organization, and he was the one who set up a special directorate called the Fifth Chief Directorate, specifically tasked with suppressing and persecuting dissidents. It was he who expanded the horrendous practice that I know existed also here in Romania under the Ceausescu regime of punitive psychiatry, where when people who opposed the communist government were declared mentally insane and put away in torturous conditions in psychiatric institutions. So Andropov was a symbol of all of this, and it was to him that Vladimir Putin chose to unveil a memorial plaque at the very beginning of his rule. Again, symbols matter in Russia, symbols are important. And very quickly, symbols turned into actions, first in terms of the internal repression, as Mr. Putin moved to silence independent television networks, expunge the opposition from parliament, turn elections into meaningless rituals with predetermined results, turn parliament into a rubber stamp, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, began the violence. First, the violent dispersals of peaceful opposition rallies, then the imprisonment of opponents, then the murders of opponents. As we know, the two most prominent leaders of the democratic opposition in Russia, Boris Nemtsov and Alexei Navalny, have been killed on Vladimir Putin's personal orders. But all this while all of this was going on, we saw many Western leaders, not all, but many Western leaders, willfully turn a blind eye to all of this, willfully ignore everything that was going on inside Russia, the domestic repression, the domestic abuses, I guess in the hope of maintaining some sort of a modus operandi with Vladimir Putin on the international level. You know, continue to invite him to international summits, roll out a red carpet, shake his hand, look into his eyes and see his soul, push reset buttons and whatever else. But apart from being, in my view, profoundly immoral, this policy was also very impractical and very short-sighted because of this link, very clear link that exists in Russia between internal repression and external aggression. And so sure enough, very soon Mr. Putin moved outside our borders, first with the incursion into Georgia, then with the first invasion of Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea in 2014, then with the intervention into the Syrian civil war on the side of the dictator Assad, and finally, of course, with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine 3+ years ago, the largest military conflict on European soil since the end of the Second World War. We know from history that aggressors do not stop until and unless they are stopped. And so to answer your question, Cosmin, this war will carry on in whatever shape or form for as long as Vladimir Putin remains in power. When people talk about peace negotiations and peace deals, especially all this talk over the recent weeks, I always prefer to use the term ceasefire, because there is not going to be peace for as long as Putin remains in power. A ceasefire, I do believe, is possible. In this sense, I'm more optimistic than former Prime Minister Kasyanov, who was on this spot yesterday. And in my view, the most important provision that can be achieved as part of the ceasefire is the provision for the release of all the captives of this war. There is nothing we can do to return the hundreds of thousands of human lives lost as a result of this war of aggression. But there are tens of thousands of human lives that still can be saved, and these are the people who are held hostages or captives as a result of this invasion. I'm talking not only about prisoners of war, that sort of goes without saying, that's provided explicitly in the Third Geneva Convention for the release and repatriation of prisoners of war after the end of active hostilities, but I'm also talking about the tens of thousands of Ukrainian captives, a category that should not even exist in international law because the Geneva Convention explicitly prohibits taking civilians as hostage during wartime, but this is what Putin's army is doing. I'm speaking about the tens of thousands of Ukrainian children who have been abducted and stolen and transferred forcibly to Russian or Russian-occupied territory. By the way, an internationally recognized war crime, which has been the reason for Vladimir Putin's indictment as a war criminal and an arrest warrant issued for him by the International Criminal Court. And finally, I'm talking about Russian political prisoners who have been jailed for the only reason that they've chosen not to remain silent in the face of this aggression, and they've spoken out against this war, a criminal offense that is punishable by long prison sentences in Putin's Russia today. Everything else that will be agreed, in my view, everything else that will be agreed as part of this ceasefire will be by definition temporary. Even if the current American administration forces Ukraine to accept de facto some of the territorial losses, this will be temporary because any post-Putin democratic government in Russia that will want to seek international legitimacy, that will want to seek a return to normality in international affairs, that will want to seek a return to the civilized world and exit out of isolation, will necessarily go back to the internationally recognized borders of 1991. I have no doubt of this. So anything else will be temporary, but human lives are at stake now. And many of these people, many of the Ukrainian captives, many of the Russian political prisoners will physically not live until the end of the Putin regime. They will die in this captivity because of the conditions in which they're held. And so whatever else has happened as part of those negotiations, as part of this deal, I really hope and expect that human lives will be made a priority.
Thank you for this very, very detailed answer. Now I will cite Ambassador Motok, who said that you are one of those speakers that you're auto-moderating yourself. So you could, I guess, you could run this this session by yourself in a masterful way. But if I may, I will try to bring something. I mean, I have many questions that pop up right from what you have already said. First, about the symbols. That's a very important thing that you touched upon. So I was wondering, how can, after this immense tragedy, how can the Russians and the Ukrainians look eye to each other after this entire period of war, which, well, hopefully it will end sooner than later? How will they be able to live with each other in a foreseeable future, so to say?
So I'll just start with some personal impressions, a personal story, if you will. I usually go to every session of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe that meets 4 times a year in Strasbourg, because, as you know, Russia was a member until the full-scale invasion. It's been later expelled, but there's still an ongoing dialogue between the Council of Europe and Russian civil society, so I usually participate in all these meetings. And Strasbourg is a really tiny airport, nothing flies there. And so the best way to get to these sessions of the Assembly is to fly to Frankfurt. Then I usually take a rental car and drive. It's a 2-hour drive. Very pleasant, very nice, very quick drive to Strasbourg from Frankfurt. Now, just like you, I'm a historian. I know what Alsace-Lorraine is. I know how much blood was spilled between Germany and France over this land. I know how many years of battles and wars and conflict have happened there, since the Napoleonic Wars, then the Franco-Prussian War, then the First World War, then the Second World War. And now I'm driving from Frankfurt to Strasbourg. I do not even know if I'm still in Germany or already in France. There is no border. There's the same currency. People live in friendship and neighborhood and cooperation with each other. And there are still people alive today who fought in the Second World War. This is still within the life of one generation. If Germany and France were able to reconcile after everything that happened, I have absolutely no doubt that Russia and Ukraine will as well. But having said that, this is not going to be easy, this is not going to be quick. This is going to be a long road, and it will, needless to say, require a much bigger effort on our part than on Ukraine's part, because the aggressor here is the Putin regime in Russia. I believe that the path to reconciliation will lead through accountability, something that never happened in Russia in the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet regime, and that, in my view, was what led us to this moment. Not just this moment, but the whole last 25 years of Putin's regime. There will need to be real accountability for all the war crimes and crimes against humanity that Putin's army has conducted in Ukraine. The Council of Europe, which I mentioned, is in the process now of setting up a special tribunal specifically on the war in Ukraine, the main goal of which is to detail and chronicle and document every single case of every war crime and crime against humanity that has been committed during this war, including the names of people who are responsible. From what I last heard, they have now already documented more than 12,000 such cases. This is invaluable work, and this is a work that will have a great importance in the future, because we cannot just pretend that nothing happened and just sort of, brush ourselves off, turn the page and move on, not after what happened here. There will need to be full accountability. There will need to be a full transparency about what is going on. And I think that that is the path we will need to travel. In my final statement to the Moscow City Court, before they gave me my 25-year sentence 2 years ago, I said that I know that there will come a day when Russian society will open its eyes and be horrified at all the crimes that were being committed in its name. I am happy to repeat these words today. I believe that is the path to reconciliation. But I have no doubt that with the right effort, with the genuineness of this effort, we can overcome this. If the Germans and French could do it, we could do it as well.
Yeah, and instantly I have two other questions. I don't know which one is more important, but as you talked about that moment when the Russians will actually open up their eyes in front of the horrors, I was wondering, what is the situation now? How are the Russians internally? How would you depict the life inside Russia now? Are they enrolled? Are they isolated? Are they satisfied? Are they traumatized? Are they being caught in the middle? Because we've seen many polls throughout these 3 years at least, when it comes to accountability, the thing that we have already pointed out. So how do the Russians feel about this war?
I think the two prevailing sentiments now in Russian society are fear and insecurity. There is no enthusiastic support for this war, as the Putin propaganda tries to portray. There is also no active public opposition to the war, because people who are against the war know that, what happened to us will happen to them if they speak out publicly against it. Having said that, we do have a record number of political prisoners in Russia today. The latest figure from Memorial, the leading human rights organization in Russia, co-laureate of the 2022 Nobel Peace Prize, is that the latest publicly known figure, meaning every person known by name, of Russian political prisoners in today's Russia is more than 3,000 people. To put it in context, in the mid-1980s, the whole of the Soviet Union, which is 15 countries put together, had about 700. So the levels of repression in Putin's Russia have reached proportions that far outweigh even the late Soviet period. And of course, the single biggest reason for these repressions are public protests against the war in Ukraine. But for the majority of the population, I think fear and insecurity are the two prevailing sentiments. And fear, of course, is something that is being actively induced and encouraged by the Putin regime. This is how they rule. This is what their propaganda tries to instill in people. This is what repression is meant to achieve. Every one of our trials, every one of the trials of people who were in prison for opposing the war, as I was, these trials, not the trials themselves, but the verdicts, are made as public as possible. State TV always talks about them. because that's the point of this repression, is to make everybody else afraid. Because there are millions of people in Russia who are against this war, but they want to make people understand that, you know, if you go out and do something, you'll spend the next 10 years in prison. And it's literally, it's for anything. I mean, for a Facebook post, for standing with a placard, for standing with a blank sheet of paper, in cases like this, and people go to prison for 5, 7, 10 years. A few months ago, a man in Moscow named Yuri Kakhovets received 5 years in prison for simply responding to an opinion poll question on the street of Moscow, saying that he's against the war in Ukraine. They tracked him down, they identified him, they put him on trial, they gave him 5 years in prison. He didn't do anything, he didn't rally, he didn't call anybody to do anything. He just said that he's against the war, 5 years in prison. And this is very deliberate. And they make sure that people know about it and people see it. But having said that, I think one of the major problems is that, however bizarre this will sound to citizens of democratic countries now in the 21st century, a very significant part of the Russian population is not even aware of all the horrors that are happening in Ukraine, because at the same time as Putin launched a full-scale invasion in February 2022, literally in the first week after it, he shut down every remaining independent media voice in Russia. Radio Echo of Moscow, closed. TV, radio, and television channel, closed. Novaya Gazeta, closed. At the same time, there's a prevailing Chinese-style online censorship introduced. So all the social media are blocked. Independent media websites are blocked. There's just no way to access them. And I frankly think that this is where the priority of the free world should be, is try to reach as many people inside Russia as possible with truthful, objective information in the Russian language about what is happening there. I'll tell you another personal story. When I was first arrested, this was April 2022, about 6 weeks into the full-scale invasion, I was first brought to Vodnik prison, in northwest Moscow, and I was placed in a cell of 6 people. So it was me plus 5 others. And by an unwritten instruction in the Russian prison system, they're not allowed to hold political prisoners together. So I was the only political in the cell. The others were just normal, you know, regular, ordinary prisoners, you know, drug offenses, tax fraud, economic crimes, whatever, something like this. So it was just an average cross-section of people from the street in Moscow. And when I moved into the cell, all the 5 others thought of the war in Ukraine, what they were told to think of the war in Ukraine by the television screen that was working all day in the cell. And I had to get a lot of patience. I had to start talking, explaining, answering questions, presenting facts, arguing again, arguing some more. After about 3 or 4 weeks, after about a month, the whole cell thought of the war, what I think of it. Not because I said something genius or brilliant. I did not. I just gave people the facts. And this is the root of the problem. Because at the end of the day, the majority of people in Russia, just like the majority of people in any country, are normal people. Any normal person would prefer peace to war. Any normal person would be horrified at the thought of civilians and children being murdered and hospitals and schools and residential buildings being bombed. The problem is a significant part of the Russian population has no idea about this. And so it should really be a priority, I believe, for the free world to try to reach with that information inside the country. But unfortunately, what we're seeing these last few months has been the exact opposite. We all know what Mr. Trump has done with the US international broadcasting system, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, all those, as the communists called them, foreign enemy voices that played such a crucial role in bringing about the fall of the Soviet system and other communist systems in Eastern Europe. The Trump administration just shut all of that down. Western big tech companies very often also are essentially acting as accomplices to Putin's censorship. A few months ago, we had a joint op-ed in the Washington Post with Yulia Navalnaya, the widow of Alexei Navalny, and Ilya Yashin, who was my fellow political prisoner, who was in the same exchange as me last year. And we wanted to draw attention to the fact, and the reason we published it in an American newspaper, the fact that Apple, to use the example that everybody knows, a lot of us have those phones in our pockets, in the last 6 months, Apple, at the request of the Putin government, has taken down more than 50 VPN services from its app store in Russia. Those services allow you to go around internet censorship. They've taken down, also at the request of the Putin government, apps belonging to independent media organizations like the BBC Russian service, Meduza, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which is an American-funded broadcaster, and many others, Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. They wanted to continue doing business in Putin's Russia. They want to continue making money in Putin's Russia. And so why not just grant this one little request? The exact opposite should be happening here. You know, if it was possible for the West, with the technologies of the 1970s, to reach tens of millions of people inside the communist bloc, inside the Warsaw Pact, including this country, including my country, including Ukraine, Poland, Latvia, all the captive nations, they reached tens of millions of people with their short-wave radio signals that were beamed literally across the Iron Curtain. You know, I remember one of my first memories is growing up in a communal flat in Moscow, Kommunalka, was of my grandfather listening every evening to this Latvian-made Spidola radio transistor, looking for short waves to listen to BBC or Voice of America broadcast. If this was possible to do 50 years ago, it should certainly be possible to do with the technologies we have today. The problem is that there's political will is lacking. And in fact, very opposite now, especially with the new American administration, not only is it lacking, it's actually going on the other side.
Well, I cannot help myself and ask that. If you remember in your last point, the American administration, where do you see this tango, or the beginning of a tango, going between Russia and the US? Do you think that there will be a full normalization of relationship? And if that would be the case, what do you think would be the impact on at least on our region? Not to mention, of course, some other places around the world.
Well, first of all, I think that the Kremlin must have run out of champagne now, because they've been opening a bottle every day since at least the 20th of January, because it's just been unbelievable what's been happening in the US policy towards Russia in these 4 months. I mean, I don't even know where to start. In this time, the US president has invited Putin back into the G8. The US has voted against Ukraine at the United Nations, siding with Putin, with North Koreans, with Eritrea, you know, with similarly wonderful democratic nations, on the resolution to condemn the invasion on the 3rd anniversary. The US president has repeatedly tried to dilute the blame for this war and talk about the Ukraine war as some sort of a conflict, as if two sides are to blame here, which is, needless to say, the opposite of reality. There's a clear aggressor, there's a clear victim. And it wasn't just words, although words are important on this level, but it wasn't just words. We've seen in early March the actual withdrawal of US intelligence sharing with Ukraine after the spat, the public, you know, assault on Zelensky in the White House. And that withdrawal actually led to hundreds of casualties in Ukraine, including civilian casualties, because for a while they were left defenseless against Russian missile attacks because they didn't know where the missiles were coming from, because the Americans withdrew intelligence. And of course, everything that the US president is doing with regard to fully dismantling the system of international democracy or human rights assistance, which they already have done. What they're doing with dismantling the entire system of US international broadcasting. I mean, don't take my word for it. A couple of weeks ago, Margarita Simonyan, who's one of the main faces of the Kremlin propaganda, head of RT Russia Today, was taking part in one of the TV shows on Russian state television. And she was openly gloating. She was saying, this is just awesome. She was talking about the decision to shut down Voice of America and Radio Free Europe. She said, this is awesome. There was nothing we could do with these media outlets for decades. But now the Americans are killing them off themselves. And I have to be honest, Cosmin, well, Mr. Putin could not have got luckier than with what he has in the White House now. And it just seems, certainly by the way these negotiations are going on a ceasefire, it seems whatever Putin says or does, Trump is going to justify him and is going to explain it away. And he's going to try to put the blame on the other side, both the European Union and Ukraine. And all I can say is that, well, this is going to be the reality for the next 4 years. And to me, it's clear that the title of the leader of the free world, that for such a long time has been undisputably held by the United States of America, is now vacant. Because there's no way this administration can claim that title. And so I do believe it is very important that Europe, the European Union, steps up and assumes that mantle of the leader of the free world, because somebody has to.
Thank you for that. Because that gives me another another option to ask you something about Europe now, because you said that Europe could or should step up in these turbulent times. But of course, my worry is that, and I guess everyone here in the room has heard so far that there are a lot of worries among us, and of course among others, that Europe doesn't have still the capacity to move so fast to take up to this position. But if we look again, from Moscow, do you think that the Russian perspective or strategic approach over Europe will change in the upcoming years? We hear now almost from every source that Europe is, let's say, the biggest source of blame in what is happening now, because the US somehow, it seems, that is becoming the good guy in the room. So every blame is to put on Europe. But do you see any possibility for change? Do you see any possibility for predictability in European-Russian affairs in the future?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right about this sort of shifting narratives. I sometimes even almost feel sorry for these Putin propagandists. No, I don't really, but they do have to shift sometimes, at a day's notice. Up until 4.5 months ago, the United States of America was the biggest enemy, the big devil. Now it's the biggest friend. And, Donald Trump is praised every day, and people saying this is great. People are remembering the alliances from the Second World War, and the rest of it just literally switched 180 degrees overnight at the end of January. And yes, you're right, it's now the European Union that's the big Satan, the big enemy. You're asking if there's a possibility that Russian perspective will change. Yes, absolutely, but it directly depends on what happens domestically in Russia. Because as always, our country's foreign policy is always a derivative of the domestic policy. I mentioned at the start of our conversation that internal repression and external aggression always go together in Russia. And we know that when the government, the regime in Russia is repressive at home, it will always going to be aggressive abroad. It will always going to be encroaching on neighboring countries too, and trying to sort of expand its sphere of influence outside. But let's not forget that the reverse is also true. And when Russia is democratic, its foreign policy looks very different from what it looks like today. Just one example. In January 1991, when the Soviet leadership sent tanks into Vilnius to crush the Lithuanian independence movement, 500,000 people, 500,000 Russian people, stood on Manezhny Square, right outside the Kremlin walls in Moscow, under the slogan, "Hands off Lithuania." And Boris Yeltsin, who was not president then yet, he was still Speaker of the Russian Parliament, but that was sort of the highest position in the Russian Republic, flew to Tallinn to sign friendship and cooperation agreements with the 3 Baltic republics, as they then still were, and actually recognized their independence. He had no right to, because Russia was itself still sort of a constituent part of the USSR. He had no authority to do this, but he did it as a symbolic, political, and very important gesture. And I have many Lithuanian friends, including in the higher-up political establishment, who have never forgotten that, and who are grateful for that to this day. This is what Russia looks like when it's democratic at home. It's going to have a very different face, a very different foreign policy. And so the answer to your question, Cosmin, is the shift in Russian perspective on Europe, or I should say on the rest of Europe, because Russia itself is part of Europe. We're the largest country in Europe. Let's not separate those two, will directly depend on what's going to happen at home. And if and when, and it's of course when and not if, and we both as historians know this, that every time there's been a change of leadership in Russia, every time since 1762, since Catherine the Great's coup, every time the next following leadership was the complete reverse of the previous one, even if they came from the same system, like Khrushchev was one of Stalin's closest acolytes. He released millions of people from the Gulag. Brezhnev came after Khrushchev. He reversed his de-Stalinization. Andropov was the one who sort of tried to groom Gorbachev for the leadership. We know what Gorbachev has done. Yeltsin was the one who brought Putin, and yet Putin completely destroyed all of the accomplishments of Yeltsin's presidency. This is our historical guide. And so when, not if, but when domestic politics in Russia change, when there's a change of leadership, which will happen inevitably, there will be a window of opportunity. It's going to be very short, it's going to be very small, by definition, as these windows of opportunity always are. And this is why I believe it is so, so important. And we talked about this a little bit at breakfast today. This is why I believe this is so, so important, to be preparing for that moment of change, to make sure next time we get this right, because so many mistakes were made in the 1990s that botched that democratic transition that led us to where we are today because of simple unpreparedness, because the Soviet regime was supposed to be there forever. That's what people thought. And then it was gone in 3 days, and nobody knew what to do. That's how it's going to happen in Russia next time. And we cannot afford not to be prepared for that day after Putin. And there's a lot of homework that needs to be done by us in the Russian democratic opposition, but I believe there's also a lot of homework that needs to be done by our friends and neighbors in Europe, because it is important that the Western world, the free world, stands ready to help and assist that post-Putin Russia on its road to democracy, on its road back into the European community, back into the civilized world, because this is in the interest of all of us. Because if we just look at the map of Europe, just simply look at the map, if we still believe in that goal of guaranteeing long-term stability, security, and peace on the European continent, if we still believe in that vision, that dream, that aspiration of a Europe whole, free, and at peace, as the phrase goes, the only way that is ever going to happen is with a democratic Russia. And that is something we should all be preparing for. And the first thing is to set that goal. That may sound really sort of simple and small, but you know, in Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in the Wonderland, there's that moment, which I love, where Alice asks the Cheshire Cat, which way should I go? And the Cheshire Cat smiles at her, as he often did, and answers, well, that very much depends on where you want to get to. We should know where we want to get to. And that goal of a democratic Russia is not just in our interest as Russian citizens, that goes without saying, but it's in the interest of all of our friends and partners and neighbors on this one continent that we share together.
Let's focus a bit on the first part of this future, which is what the Russians can do and should do. Well, we've seen last week Stalin statue in the metro. I think it was Taganskaya. Please correct me if I'm wrong. It will be probably sometime soon when he will get above the ground, not only in the metro. I think it was also a poll 2 years ago where there was a question on which is the most important historical figure in Russia, and I think Stalin was also, very up. And it's not just a fascination as a historian I'm asking this, but actually my question goes into this very profound change in the educational system in Russia. And we all know how important education is for the future. It's not just for the, for the next several years, but for the next generations. So your optimism, it's truly inspiring, but I'm wondering if that window of opportunity will actually open, how will the Russians be ready to grasp it?
Thank you for that, Cosmin. First of all, on the Poles, okay, let's not seriously talk about Poles in a totalitarian dictatorship. People know what's expected of them. Stalin is glorified, as you rightly say, by the state propaganda. And by the way, he has made it above ground for a long time now. Under Putin's watch, in these 25 years, more than 100 monuments to Joseph Stalin have been erected around the country. The metro is just the latest one. The last part of your question?
How can the Russians actually grasp?
Yeah. So we're talking about the Poles. Poles are meaningless in any dictatorial system when people know what's expected of them. When they know what's going to happen, they give the wrong answer. A good friend of mine, Boris Vishnevsky, who's a long-time member of the Legislative Assembly of St. Petersburg, deputy leader of the Yabloko party, which is basically the last opposition party left in Russia, he was once at a conference in Vilnius, and he was asked by a Lithuanian journalist, why does Putin have such high approval numbers in opinion polls? And Vishnevsky turned to the journalist and said, you know what, Ceausescu had 99% approval in opinion polls just 2 weeks before he was shot, and which is a historical fact. I looked up on it. That was the official results that were published. So these polls are totally meaningless, and this goes for Stalin too. That doesn't just go for the current situation, because people know what's expected and people know what is socially acceptable in the current conditions response is. But as for the public mind and the state of public opinion, bless you, you're absolutely right that there was a Stalin monument unveiled on Taganskaya metro station last week. But you know what's also a fact? That they have a 24-hour post of 2 policemen standing next to it. Can you guess why that is? Because they know what's going to happen if there isn't. It's going to be covered in red paint tomorrow. So I think that's pretty illustrative too of what they did. And in terms of the education, yes, the regime is paying a lot of close attention to the education system. And in fact, sort of harking back, and this is linked to your question, to the Russia-Ukraine talks that just restarted in Istanbul, the world press has made a lot of the fact that the Russian delegation that Putin sent to Istanbul was really low-key, that it doesn't really take any decisions. And Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky made this point. That's true. But what's actually, I think, much more important in this case is that who heads that delegation? This is so-called historian Vladimir Medinsky, whose doctoral thesis, by the way, has been publicly found to be plagiarized. He's totally discredited in the academic community, which doesn't prevent him from holding these high positions in the Kremlin. He was the author of the history textbook for 10th and 11th graders that has been compulsory in Russian schools beginning in September 2022. And I've read that textbook. I've asked my lawyers, I was still in prison, I asked my lawyers to sort of bring me the photocopies of it. I just wanted to see what it is, what all the fuss was about. And it was just mind-boggling to read it. I mean, there were things like, he writes that the 1968 Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia and the 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan were actually done because those countries had asked for it. That it says it in a textbook. It basically glorifies and whitewashes the Soviet regime and talks about dissidents, people like Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn and Bukovsky, as agents of foreign influence. It, of course, talks about presents the current Ukrainian state as a neo-Nazi puppet state, where there's a military junta that is ruling since the coup d'etat in 2014. But this is just total baloney that is now being compulsorily taught to 10th and 11th graders for 2 years now. So I fully take your point, and I agree with it. I mean, that's what any dictatorial regime in any country tries to do, but especially in Russia. As you know well, it's said that, you know, any government in Russia seeks to control not just the present, but the past too, and that's hence the plaque to Andropov, hence the restoration of the Stalin-era national anthem, which Putin did in the first year in power 25 years ago. But you mentioned my optimism, Cosmin. I think one of the reasons for it, or one of the reasons is that I'm a historian like you, and you know, I think we know how laws of history work and how these models of development work, and nobody has yet been able to circumvent that logic in those models, and Mr. Putin is not going to be an exception. But the other big reason for my optimism is because I've seen all this before. I remember the collapse of the Soviet regime as a child. And talking specifically, answering your question about the education and talking about this Medinsky textbook, so the most ideologically charged history textbook in Soviet schools was in 4th grade. I guess they decided that that's the age you really have to start indoctrinating kids. So that's 10, 11 years of age. And that was a textbook that centered on the quote-unquote Great October Socialist Revolution. And it was all the anti-religious and anti-clerical stuff in there. There was the nonsense that Alexander Kerensky, the Prime Minister of the Russian Provisional Government, fled the Winter Palace during the October Revolution dressed up in women's clothes. This is just a total fake. That has nothing to do with reality, but that's how tens of millions of children in the USSR were taught year after year. And so on. That was a textbook. Well, for me, 4th grade came in September 1991, just 2 weeks after the Democratic Revolution toppled the Soviet regime. The very air, it seemed, smelled of freedom. Moreover, our school, where my wife and I were in class together, was located right next to Lubyanka Square, the above-mentioned KGB headquarters. And of course, as you know, the statue to Felix Dzerzhinsky, the founder of the Cheka and KGB, was spectacularly toppled during that revolution. And we as kids, we would run during recess to watch the empty pedestal that was all covered in graffiti. And graffiti like hammer and sickle, swastika, and an equality sign between them. This was the atmosphere in the autumn of 1991. And then there was this textbook about great Lenin and all the other nonsense. And I remember well that our teacher would come into the classroom, and the first thing she would say was, "Don't open your textbooks. You can read this garbage in your own time if you want to, and I will tell you what actually happened." I'll never forget this. And I have a feeling that the Medinsky textbooks will meet with the same fate.
Yeah, talking about that, so both the 10th and the 11th grade textbooks probably will be rewritten soon, because the next school year will start. But then the US is on the good side. Well, I was reading them.
That's a good point.
I was reading them, so it was really interesting to see how well everyone is depicted there. So I guess they will probably be rewritten.
I can't resist. Just another example from that textbook. There was a passage that said, we're talking about dissidents, that said that in the 1970s, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and I quote, left the USSR. Yeah, I guess technically right, he did leave. He was first arrested, brought to Lefortovo, indicted with treason, deprived of his citizenship, driven by the KGB to the plane, put on and forcibly exiled to Germany. I guess you can say he left. That's the kind of textbook.
Yeah, it's probably, it's a matter of terminology, as always, I guess, in this, as you said.
Well, you can't argue, he did leave, right? He was no longer there.
Yeah. On this note, if I may, let's dig a bit deeper into that. And if you could address this plethora of research that has been done so far. There's a lot of academic work, expert work on the fact that President Putin is somehow trying to reconnect with the history and to be the second Russian land gatherer, so to say, right? So basically, the war happened because there were historically Russian lands. Nobody knows where and when history starts, but that's a different question. I don't want to get into that. To historians, not a good decision. But I would like to ask you something else, actually. There is actually newer research that say that actually the most important legacy that the president wants to leave for the future is, apart from the true education of the nation, the building of a new elite that would actually make sure that these good habits and good lessons of the past will not be forgotten. So how do you find that? What's the true legacy of this?
First, I'm not going to go into historical arguments about lands, but I can't resist making two quick points. First of all is about which lands are historically whose. When Putin published that map, he first showed it to Valery Zorkin, the chair of the Constitutional Court, in 2022, and then it was published on the Kremlin social media. A map, I don't know, from the 17th century showing that there's no Ukraine, that this is all Russian or Polish lands. The former president of Mongolia responded on his Twitter feed by publishing the map of the Tatar-Mongol Empire that stretched all the way to Budapest. And he said, what about that? So that's an endless argument, and it's meaningless, because that's why we have international law. And that's why we have recognized borders. Or if we don't, then nobody does. Because if we start arguing about which lands were whose, then there are always somebody's at some point. Where do we draw that line? That's why international law is important. And secondly, and forgive me, Cosmin, for this semantic point, but I can't resist making it too. In your question, twice you referred to Putin as President Putin. He's not president, he is a usurper. From a very legal point of view, this is not a political opinion. Last year, the two largest parliamentary bodies in Europe, the European Parliament and the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, overwhelmingly adopted resolutions recognizing Vladimir Putin for what he is, an illegitimate usurper. Not even talking about the fact that we haven't had a free election in Russia for 25 years, not even talking about the fact that we have no independent media, that we have no political pluralism. Forget all that for a moment. From a purely legal point of view, the way he overturned the presidential term limits with what lawyers call an ad hominem exclusion just for himself, that completely violates all the basic tenets of both Russian and international law. And for that very simple reason, the two largest interparliamentary bodies on this continent have ruled Putin to be an illegitimate usurper. And so let's not use the title of president. He's not. And that's why, by the way, to go back to one of your previous questions, that's why it's so dangerous what Trump is doing. Because that can have an effect of sort of, quote unquote, re-legitimizing Putin at the world stage, something to which he's not entitled to at all. And on your question about the elites, I wouldn't use the word elite. It's too good for that. These are just, I mean, if you look at these, you know, the sons of Chaika and Deripaska and the daughter of Peskov and all these characters, this is just, you know, what in the Soviet Union used to be called the golden youth, people who are just sort of, you know, enjoying the unearned riches and unearned privileges because of their parents' high position. These people have no principles, they have no ideology, they have no strategy, no goals, nothing. I don't think we should dignify them by calling them an elite. This regime is by definition personalistic. This is not an ideological dictatorship like the Soviet Union was. This regime, I mean, Putin himself refers it to a vertical of power. Such regimes do not survive the change of the person at the top. And so I don't think we should pay any sort of serious attention to talk about this generational shift. It's not going to happen by definition. But the very important part of your question about the legacy. I think the legacy of Vladimir Putin in history will be that he took Russia when he came to power as an internationally respected country, as a member of the G8, as a member of the Council of Europe, as a country that had goodwill from much of the world, that was an integral part of the civilized world and of the international community. And he's going to leave it when he leaves power sooner or later as a rogue regime, as a discredited, isolated state that has no friends except North Korea and Iran, that has been kicked out of all the major international institutions, that has completely destroyed relations with its closest neighbors. And after this man is gone, we, or whoever is in charge of that process, will have a mammoth task ahead of us, a long and difficult road of trying to rebuild our country from the ruins to which Putin reduced it. That's going to be his legacy.
Okay. As you pointed out, again, this look into the future, given the lessons in Ukraine, I cannot help myself to ask that. Given the lessons of the war in Ukraine, do you think that there is still a chance for another military intervention in the post-Soviet space? Of course, future Ukrainian, if, of course, this is after the ceasefire, the president, Putin will not be satisfied. Do you think that there is room for another military intervention? I don't know, you name it, Kazakhstan, whatever, whatever might be on site. That would be the first, and because we're running very, very fast on time, do you think that Russia might actually be tempted to test NATO conventionally? We know that there are three, let's say, soft parts, soft regions. That is the Baltics, that's Poland, and of course Romania. Do you think that is the case for the foreseeable future?
I'll actually respond, yes, but I'll respond to those two with the same fundamental response. If Putin is allowed to get away with Ukraine, then not only might, there will be another war. And I don't think it's going to be Kazakhstan, it's going to be Moldova or Georgia. Georgia, in any case, there's already a Putin-light regime being established there. So he's sort of taking it over in a hybrid way. They're doing everything exactly the same as Putin. They have the foreign agents law, they're closing down NGOs, they're rigging elections. It's already like a Putin-light, of course, directed behind the scenes from behind the scenes by Bidzina Ivanishvili, a Kremlin-connected oligarch, the former head of the Rossiyski Kredit Bank in Moscow. Moldova is a very vulnerable place, especially given the sort of the Trojan horse of the Transnistria that's already in there. And the same goes for testing NATO, especially, you know, after a few more of speeches by Mr. Trump saying that if Europe doesn't pay up, they're not going to come to defend it. And people are now beginning to question whether Article 5 even exists, or if he's going to continue talking about annexing other member states of NATO, like Canada or Danish Greenland. Anything is possible. And look, I mean, it's even crazy that we're sitting here with you in the year 2025 and discussing what may or may not happen if the aggressor continues to be appeased. We know what happens when the aggressor is appeased. We know this from the Munich Agreement in 1938. We don't need any more lessons in this. We also know it from the last 25 years of Western interactions with Putin, because he was led away with Georgia, he was led away with Crimea and the incursion into Eastern Donbass. So sure enough came February 2022. If he's not stopped here, there will be more, and he has to be stopped now.
Thank you, Vladimir. I think we could actually proceed for hours and hours, and I am truly sorry that I cannot open the round of questions from the audience. I think that they would be probably way better than mine. So I'm sorry for that. The guilt is only mine. I thank you for being here today, for sharing your thoughts, and for sharing so many details that some of us probably didn't have. You, I think, opened a lot of or cleared a lot of things for us today, but you gave us even more questions to think about. So I cannot be more grateful for this discussion, and I invite you to a round of applause for Vladimir. Thank you so much, Vladimir.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that. Yeah, let's continue this.